I had a fight with my little girl and canceled all sponsorship for her engagement party, so she cut me off. But a week later, I was told there would be a gathering. I thought she wanted to reconcile. When I arrived, I found out she had taken me to court with her stupid mother, my ex-wife, present. They threatened that if I don't pay the money, I'll never see my grandkid again. But I knew I had a revenge plan ready. I just needed to make one phone call. My name is Robert Kane, and I'm sharing this story because I think it's important for people to understand how quickly family relationships can deteriorate when money becomes involved. What happened to me 4 days before everything fell apart still haunts me, but I've learned some valuable lessons that I hope might help others. It was a quiet evening, and I was sitting at the mahogany table in my study with a pen in one hand and a calculator in the other. Spread out before me was the most ridiculous wedding quote I'd ever seen in my life. $85,000. Let me repeat that, $85,000 for a single day. Not a house, not a college degree, not even a down payment on something that would last more than 24 hours. Just one day filled with expensive dresses, overpriced florists, a venue with some ridiculous name that sounded more like a perfume than an actual place, and enough hors d'oeuvres to feed a small country. My daughter Claire had called this vision her dream wedding. I had to be honest with myself. I called it a delusion. Don't get me wrong, I love my daughter more than life itself. God knows I do, and I have from the moment I first held her in my arms back when Helen, my ex-wife, still smiled at me like I was worth something. I knew even then that I'd take on the world if Claire ever asked me to. I have so many precious memories with her. I remember braiding her hair during her terrible 7th grade phase when she wanted to be a Viking warrior of all things. I snuck out of work to watch her recite Shakespeare in a gymnasium that smelled like old sweat and cafeteria food. I even cried when she got into Duke University, quietly of course, because I didn't want to embarrass her, but I was so incredibly proud. But now, on this particular evening, she stood in my kitchen dressed in designer workout clothes that clearly hadn't seen a drop of sweat. She was flipping through Pinterest on her tablet, listing wedding vendors like she was planning a royal coronation. She was 28 years old, but in that moment, she sounded exactly like she did when she was 16 again. Spoiled, certain of getting her way, and completely impatient with any resistance. "Dad, I just need you to say yes," she said, not even looking up from her screen. $85,000 isn't a big deal for someone like you. You always said you wanted to be involved in my wedding planning. I took a deep breath and slid a check across the kitchen counter toward her. $18,000, I said as calmly as I could manage. "That's what I'm offering you, Claire. It's generous. It comes from a place of love, and it's what I can afford to give without dipping into my retirement savings or having to sell property." Her fingers froze over the tablet screen. She looked at the check like I'd just insulted her entire bloodline. 18,000? Dad, that's honestly an insult. Then consider it a respectful one, I replied, maintaining my calm tone. That response didn't go over well at all. Her face hardened in a way that reminded me painfully of how Helen's used to look when something didn't go her way. Her cheeks flushed with anger and indignation. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "This is my wedding, my only wedding. I'm not asking you for a loan that I'll have to pay back someday. I'm asking for your support as my father." I almost laughed at the irony, but I held it back. Support? I had been supporting her for her entire life. I'd paid for her tuition, bought her first car, covered her rent during tough times, and bailed her out of countless financial emergencies. I hadn't taken a proper vacation since 2009 because I'd been constantly setting aside money for those just-in-case moments that always seemed to involve either Claire or Helen needing me to play the role of financial firefighter. "I am supporting you," I said firmly. $18,000 is not nothing, Claire. It's a substantial amount of money that comes from years of careful saving. "Whatever!" she snapped, and before I could stop her, she snatched the check from the counter and tore it in half right in front of me. "Michael's parents said they'd give us way more money anyway." "Good for them," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "Then you won't need mine." She left in complete silence after that. She didn't storm out with a dramatic door slam or deliver some cutting exit line like you see in movies. It was somehow worse than that. She just gathered her things and was gone, leaving me standing alone in my kitchen with the pieces of my torn check scattered on the counter. That confrontation happened 4 days ago, and what came next hurt more than I ever expected it would. The silence that followed wasn't just disappointing. It was devastating in a way that caught me completely off guard. I tried calling Claire the next day, not once, but twice. Both calls went straight to voicemail. I didn't want to seem desperate or pushy, so I sent her a single text message just to let her know I was thinking about her and that I loved her. Nothing came back. Not even one of those brief thanks responses that people send when they don't really want to talk, but feel obligated to acknowledge you. By the third day, I decided to check something that had become a precious part of my routine. Claire and I had been sharing a photo album through our phones, where we regularly updated each other with pictures of my grandson Tyler. It was one of the few things that had remained constant and joyful in our relationship, even through the divorce and all the family complications that followed. I looked forward to seeing those little snapshots of his life, videos of him running around in superhero pajamas, pictures from their Sunday outings to the park, clips of him babbling and laughing in that infectious way that only small children can manage. When I tried to access the album, I discovered it had been removed. Or rather, I had been removed from it. Either way, the result was the same. There were no more smiling photos of Tyler, no more videos of his latest adventures, no more glimpses into his growing personality. Those simple moments of connection with my grandson had been severed along with everything else. I realized then that I had been completely blocked from Claire's life. The finality of it hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just about the money or the wedding anymore. This was about being cut off from people I loved, including an innocent child who had no say in this adult conflict. I reached out to David, my son, and Claire's younger brother, hoping he might have some insight into what was happening. When I asked if he'd heard anything from his sister, his response was both understanding and resigned. "She's mad, Dad," he said with a sigh. "And when Claire gets mad, well, you know how she is." "I know," I replied, feeling the weight of that truth. "She shuts the door and throws away the key." David's voice was sympathetic but realistic. "Just give her time. You know how she is when she feels hurt or misunderstood." Yes, I did know exactly how Claire was. I'd watched her navigate conflicts this way since she was a child. But knowing someone's patterns doesn't make experiencing them any easier, especially when you're on the receiving end of their anger and disappointment. The fourth day was perhaps the hardest. I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, going through an old box of letters and crayon drawings that Claire had made for me when she was about 8 years old. These were artifacts from a time when I was unquestionably her hero, back when our relationship existed before the complications of weddings and divorces and financial expectations had turned everything into some kind of transaction. One drawing in particular caught my attention and nearly brought me to tears. It showed a stick figure version of me wearing a paper crown, holding a balloon in one hand and her tiny stick figure hand in the other. Underneath, in her lopsided 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, "Best Daddy in the World." That little girl would have been thrilled with $20 and a trip for ice cream. She would have called it pure magic. That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and then let it sit untouched beside me for over an hour. I didn't actually drink it. I just needed it nearby. Sometimes the ritual of pouring a drink isn't about the alcohol itself. It's about feeling like you have some kind of company in the silence, some small comfort in the face of loneliness. I kept thinking about what line had been crossed, or maybe what line I had refused to cross. Was this all about protecting my savings? Was I trying to teach some kind of lesson? Or maybe, just maybe, I was finally realizing that love doesn't mean keeping your wallet open and writing blank checks whenever someone demands it. Love means having boundaries, and my boundary was simple. I would not fund something that felt more like an obligation than a celebration. Still, the guilt lingered like a persistent ache. I missed hearing Claire's voice during our regular phone calls. I missed Tyler's infectious giggle on video calls. I missed the comfortable illusion that we were still a functioning family, even if it was just maintained by habit and routine. But I also knew, deep in my bones, that if I folded now and gave in to her demands, it wouldn't end with the wedding. It would be the honeymoon next, then the house, then the nanny, then whatever came after that. Helen, my ex-wife, had taught Claire well in this regard, that persistence and emotional manipulation, could eventually wear down any resistance. Part of me wanted to call Claire and confront her directly. I wanted to ask her why she couldn't see the difference between genuine generosity and outright exploitation. I wanted to make her understand that there was a distinction between supporting someone you love and being taken advantage of by them. But I didn't make that call, because that wasn't who I wanted to be anymore. I had already spent enough years being the reasonable one, the dependable one, the one who always opened his wallet when family members needed rescuing. I was tired of being seen primarily as a financial resource rather than as a person with my own needs and limitations, so I let the silence settle around me like dust. I didn't chase after Claire with desperate phone calls or pleading messages. I didn't beg for forgiveness or try to negotiate a compromise. I just sat with the ache of loss, with that precious childhood drawing in my hands, and with the glass of whiskey that I eventually poured down the kitchen sink without drinking. In that silence, I made a quiet but firm promise to myself. If Claire and Helen wanted me back in their lives, they would have to come to me on my terms, and not for $1 over what I had already offered. 4 days after Claire had figuratively and literally slammed the door on me, I had settled into a routine of letting my phone charge silently in its cradle, untouched and ignored. I went about my mornings the way I always did. Black coffee, toast with a thin smear of strawberry jam, and the newspaper folded so I could focus only on the headlines that actually mattered to me. I had stopped expecting Claire's calls entirely. I had stopped hoping they would come at all. What I was experiencing went beyond simple grief. That word was too polite and gentle for what I was feeling. This was a fresh wound that was still actively bleeding, raw and tender to the touch. But that particular morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand in a way that made my pulse quicken immediately. I hesitated for several long seconds before picking it up, almost afraid of what I might find. The caller ID read "unknown number," which only made my heart race faster. There was really only one person left in my life who might call me without announcing herself first. "Claire?" I answered, my voice filled with both hope and caution. "Hello, Dad." Her voice was completely different from what I remembered. It was tentative, quieter, almost fragile. For a moment, I didn't recognize this version of my daughter. Gone was the anger and resentment that had characterized our last conversation. Instead, I heard something that sounded like vulnerability, maybe even fear. My chest tightened with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Claire, can we talk over dinner?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, and then she said, "I've been thinking." She seemed to be waiting for me to refuse or hang up on her. When I didn't respond negatively, she continued. "Where would you like to meet?" "The Heritage Club," she said softly. 7:30 tonight. That name hit me like a stone, dropping into the pit of my stomach. The Heritage Club wasn't just any restaurant. It was the place where Helen and I had shared some of our happiest evenings together, back in the days before the constant fighting started, before the divorce papers were filed, before she stopped believing that we had any kind of future together. It was an upscale steakhouse with linen napkins, the size of dinner plates, and lighting so perfectly soft and warm that it made everyone look flattered, even if they were having the worst day of their lives. The place held genuine sentimental value for me, which was exactly why Claire's choice of venue now felt like it might be some kind of trap. Was she trying to manipulate my emotions by choosing a location that would make me nostalgic and vulnerable? Despite my reservations, I heard myself saying, "Okay, I'll be there." "Thank you," she said, and I could hear the palpable relief in her voice. She hung up before I could say anything else, leaving me staring at the phone and wondering what I had just agreed to. I spent the rest of the day trying to will an apology into existence, hoping that when we met, Claire would have found the words to make things right between us. But no magical reconciliation materialized in my imagination, and I found myself remembering the last time I had worn my best clothes for a formal occasion, my ex-wife's retirement party, which had been awkward and strained. Now, as I prepared for this dinner, those same clothes felt like armor that I was compelled to carry into battle. I chose my outfit carefully and deliberately: a navy jacket, a crisp white shirt, and charcoal trousers. I ran my fingers over my silver cufflinks, which were mementos from my 47th birthday, and had always made me feel confident and put together. I didn't want to walk into that restaurant looking like a defeated father who had been worn down by family drama. I wanted to look like a man who still mattered, who still had dignity and self-respect, regardless of what had happened between us. When I arrived at the Heritage Club, the valet greeted me by name as though I were part of their regular clientele. I nodded politely and stepped inside, where the familiar atmosphere immediately transported me back to better times. The hostess's eyes flicked over my appearance and then consulted her reservation chart with professional efficiency. "Mr. Kane," she said with a practiced smile, "please follow me." I stood up straighter and walked behind her along a corridor lined with framed photographs of city landmarks. At the end of the hall, through etched glass doors, was the main dining room. The space was exactly as I remembered it. Candlelight danced on brass accents, and the rich scent of oak wood and sizzling steaks filled the air. My stomach clenched, but not from hunger. It was from a complicated mix of nostalgia and dread. Claire was already seated at a round table by the window, her back to the glass. She wore a burgundy dress that hugged her frame perfectly, and the fabric caught the light with every small movement she made. She looked up as I approached, and I watched her expression shift from obvious apprehension to visible relief. I thought I saw her shoulders relax slightly before she plastered what appeared to be a genuinely gentle smile on her face. "Hi, Dad," she said, standing to greet me. Her hug was brief but felt genuine, though I could feel the tension in her arms as she held me. "Claire," I said, pulling back slightly to study her face. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from work or a busy life, but the exhaustion that comes from carrying the weight of disappointment and regret. "Thanks for coming," she said as I slipped into the chair opposite her. A waiter appeared at my elbow almost immediately with a water carafe, clearly well-trained in the art of discreet service. "Red or white wine?" Claire asked before he could even speak. "Water, please," I said, and the waiter nodded and retreated to give us privacy. "I'm sorry," Claire began, fumbling nervously with the edge of her napkin. "I shouldn't have blocked you from everything. I was angry at the wedding situation, angry at Mom, angry at everything that was happening, but I shouldn't have shut you out completely." I felt the anger that had been simmering inside me for days begin to loosen its grip. It was much harder to stay mad at her when she sounded genuinely contrite and vulnerable. "I know you were hurt," I said quietly, "but it hurt me too." "I know," she whispered, blinking back tears. "I was hurt too, Dad. I thought you didn't care about me anymore. I thought you'd choose protecting your bank balance over your own daughter's happiness." "Claire," I said, leaning forward to emphasize my words, "I would never choose money over you. But I also needed you to understand that my resources aren't unlimited, and that I have rights too. I have the right to make decisions about my own finances." She nodded, wiping her eyes with her napkin. For a moment, we sat in relative silence, listening to the soft clink of cutlery and the low hum of conversations from other tables. I watched her gaze shift around the room, and I wondered if she was seeing the same ghost that I was. The booth where we'd shared our first father-daughter dinner after her college graduation. The table where Helen had once surprised me with a slice of chocolate cake on our anniversary. This place was a repository of memories, both good and bad. And I found myself wondering if Claire had chosen it intentionally because she understood its significance, or if she was simply trying to create the right atmosphere for whatever conversation was about to unfold. Before I could say anything more to Claire, Helen swept through the double doors of the restaurant with her trademark confidence that I recognized all too well. She wore a black sheath dress that fit her perfectly, and she had that practiced smile on her face. The one that looked warm from a distance but felt cold when you were close enough to see her eyes. She spotted us immediately, nodded curtly in our direction, and strode over to our table with the kind of purposeful walk that suggested this encounter was anything but coincidental. "Robert," she said, leaning casually on the back of my chair. Her perfume was exactly the same as it had always been, jasmine with a hint of citrus that used to comfort me but now felt invasive. "I didn't realize you and Claire were meeting here tonight." "It was her idea," I managed, standing up to greet her properly, though every instinct told me this was about to become complicated. Helen's eyes flicked briefly to my suit, taking in my appearance, then moved to Claire's tear-stained cheeks. I could see her processing the scene, calculating her next move. "Claire told me you'd agreed to come," she said, her voice remaining perfectly even. "That's good." She smiled again, but this time it was less warm and more strategic. The three of us sat down in what immediately became an awkward triangle. I watched as Helen surveyed the table setup, then turned her attention back to me with that assessing look I remembered from our marriage. The one that meant she was about to make a move in some game I didn't know we were playing. "I hope we can be civil tonight," she said, as if she were the reasonable one trying to keep the peace. I opened my mouth to respond, but Claire's hand suddenly reached across the table and covered mine. She looked at me with what I now recognized as shame in her eyes, and I realized that whatever was about to happen, she knew about it in advance. "Mom, please," Claire said softly, and there was something in her tone that made my stomach drop. I squeezed her hand gently. "Of course," I said, looking directly at Helen. Civility is a start. A waiter appeared with menus, and Helen immediately ordered a bottle of red wine without bothering to ask what Claire and I might want. It was such a typical Helen move, assuming control of the situation and making decisions for everyone else. Claire and I exchanged glances, and I could see the discomfort in her expression. I ordered a filet for myself, and Claire chose the special salmon. As we settled into what felt like an uneasy calm, I began to realize that this dinner was turning into some kind of crossroads. Something was happening here that went beyond a simple family reconciliation, and I could feel the tension building like electricity in the air before a storm. Somewhere between the appetizers and the main courses, I knew I was going to have to decide whether I was here to rebuild bridges with my daughter and ex-wife, or whether I was about to watch those bridges burn completely. The atmosphere felt charged with unspoken agendas and hidden motives. But I also knew that if I walked out now, if I let my suspicions and discomfort drive me away from this table, I might never get another chance to repair my relationship with Claire. So I stayed. I listened to the conversation, answered Helen's carefully worded questions, and tried to read the subtext in every exchange. The food arrived, and we made polite conversation about neutral topics, the weather, current events, anything that didn't touch on the wedding or our recent conflict. But I could feel something building beneath the surface, like pressure in a kettle that was about to whistle. When the lawyers arrived and took seats across from us, folders in hand and expressions that were all business, I finally understood exactly how far Helen and Claire were willing to go. This wasn't a reconciliation dinner at all. This was a carefully orchestrated ambush, and I had walked right into it. But for now, in those last few minutes before everything changed, before the real purpose of this evening was revealed, nothing felt more fragile than the hope that Claire and I might actually find our way back to each other. I held on to that hope even as I watched the lawyers settle into their chairs and prepare to destroy it completely. The doors of the Heritage Club had admitted me with such warmth and familiarity, but now I realized I had stepped into something much more dangerous than a simple family dinner. The warm glow of the dining room, the carefully arranged candlelight, the polished wood, it all suddenly felt like a beautiful trap, designed to make me comfortable before they sprung whatever they had planned. I took a steadying breath and prepared myself for whatever was coming next, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just the future of my relationship with Claire, but possibly the entire trajectory of my life. The doors of the Heritage Club swung open behind me, and I took a steadying breath before stepping into the warm glow of the dining room. Candlelight flickered on polished wood, illuminating the faces around the table as if they were portraits in a carefully curated gallery. Each expression had been crafted with deliberate precision, and I was beginning to understand that I was the only one who didn't know what performance was about to unfold. Claire sat in the same burgundy dress as the night before, but now her shoulders were squared and her posture was more guarded. Helen stood beside her, radiating the kind of predatory confidence that set my teeth on edge and made my skin crawl. And then I saw them. 3 men in dark, conservative suits who glanced up from a thick folder on the table as I approached. Lawyers. The realization hit me like a physical blow. These were lawyers, sitting at what I had thought was supposed to be a family reconciliation dinner. They were armored predators waiting to pounce, and I was apparently their prey. Helen motioned with a delicate hand gesture as though she were orchestrating a symphony or directing a play. "Robert," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Thank you for coming again tonight." Her eyes were cold, though, and I couldn't mistake the calculated look behind that polite welcome. This was Helen in full strategist mode, the version of her that had always made me deeply uncomfortable during our marriage. I slid into the empty chair opposite Claire, directly across from the three men who were stacked neatly in a row like pieces on a chessboard. They had cold, impassive faces, and one of them wore a smile that looked nervous, the way a man smiles just before he springs a carefully planned trap. Claire's gaze flickered between me and her mother, but she remained silent. I clutched the menu in my hands without opening it, my mind racing back to our conversation from earlier in the evening. Her apology, my cautious forgiveness, the tentative hope that we might actually repair our relationship. Had all of that been nothing more than setup for this moment? I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest, and looked directly at the lawyers. They sat stiffly with their folders closed, hands steepled in front of them, like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. Just like that, I knew with absolute certainty that this dinner was about much more than healing old wounds or bridging family divides. This was an ambush, plain and simple. Helen cleared her throat with theatrical precision. "Before we begin tonight, Robert," she said, tapping the thick folder in front of one of the younger lawyers, "I want you to review this document." The lawyer's suit jacket was perfectly tailored. His hair was impeccably combed, and his eyes darted just enough that I caught the flicker of triumph in them. He was enjoying this moment, anticipating some kind of victory. "It's a power of attorney," Helen continued, her tone deceptively light, as though she were offering me a gift rather than a trap. "If you sign this, we'll know that your affairs will be handled responsibly from now on. Your finances, your property, everything will be managed properly." She smiled as she said this, but her smile completely lacked warmth. It was the smile of a predatory lender who knows you have no other options, the smile of someone who believes they've already won. I stared at the folder, at the words "Power of Attorney" stamped in bold letters across the tab. My stomach churned as the implications sank in. I had spent decades safeguarding my estate, meticulously planning my finances, saving carefully, and trusting only a handful of people with my most sensitive information. Now they wanted unrestricted access to my accounts, my investments, even the house where I had raised my children. My hands did not tremble, and I kept my voice steady as I spoke. I placed the menu on the table deliberately and let my gaze shift from the folder to Helen's face. "Power of attorney," I repeated slowly. "Is that what you think reconciliation looks like?" She blinked once, and I caught the tiny imperfection in her composed facade. It was the first crack in her confidence. "Robert, it's not personal," she said quickly. "It's practical. You're aging, your parents are gone, and we worry about you. We worry about your ability to manage everything on your own." "Worry," I echoed, letting the single word hang in the air like an accusation. "You worry. You worry enough to bring 3 lawyers to what I thought was supposed to be a family dinner to make things right between us." "You asked me here under the guise of an apology," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "And you asked me here under the pretense of wanting to repair our relationship." Claire's face paled visibly. She glanced at me with guilt flickering in her eyes, and I could see that she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. Helen laid a protective hand on her daughter's arm. "Honey, that's not fair," she said. I held up a finger to stop her. "Let me finish," I said firmly. I sat forward, leaning so close that the soft glow of the candle flickered across my features. "I didn't come here tonight to sign away my rights as a human being. I came because I thought that maybe, just maybe, there was still trust between my daughter and me." And apparently I was completely wrong. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The one with the nervous smile cleared his throat. "Mr. Kane, perhaps you should actually read the document before you make any decisions." I gripped the edge of the table, feeling my anger crystallize into something sharp and focused. "I've read enough legal documents in my lifetime to know exactly what this is. You think I'm incompetent. You believe I can't manage my own affairs. You think that you and my own daughter are justified in weaponizing the law against me?" My voice was low but fierce, fueled by the adrenaline that comes from being betrayed by the people you trust most. "Is that your plan, Helen? To strip me of my autonomy while hiding behind family values and concern for my well-being?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly not prepared for this level of resistance. The tall lawyer cleared his throat again. "If I may, Mr. Kane, this type of arrangement is actually quite standard in families where one party requires additional support or oversight." "Standard?" I leaned back, shaking my head in disbelief. You think this is standard? If it's so standard and reasonable, why did you hide it until now? Why not discuss this calmly, like adults, instead of staging this hostage scenario over dinner? Silence stretched between us like a taut wire. I looked across the table at Claire, whose eyes were shining with tears. My heart clenched at the sight of her obvious anguish, but I refused to back down. Claire, I said, my voice softening slightly, this is about more than money or convenience. This is about respect. Respect for my life, my choices, and my dignity as a human being. I turned back to Helen, my resolve hardening. You'll find that I'm not signing anything tonight. Not this document, not any document. She paled, and I watched the color drain from her carefully applied makeup. One by one, the lawyers stood from their chairs, closing their folders with precise, disappointed motions. The nervous one muttered an apology that was too quiet for me to hear clearly, but I saw his lips move. The taller one nodded curtly, as though he were disappointed that they had lost this particular round. Helen's carefully constructed facade cracked completely for a fraction of a second. She opened her mouth as if to plead with me, but instead she said, "Then we're done here." She gathered her purse with sharp, angry movements, helped Claire to her feet, and the three of them left the restaurant as though they were being swept away by an invisible tide. The table they left behind felt emptier somehow, and the candles seemed dimmer in their absence. I sat there for several minutes, my chest heaving with the aftermath of confrontation. The waiter reappeared, looking concerned. "Sir, may I clear the table for you?" I nodded, pushing the untouched menu aside. My appetite had vanished long before dinner was supposed to begin. I paid the check promptly, refusing the manager's offer of a complimentary dessert to make up for the disruption. Then I stepped back into the cool night air, feeling the city lights blink above me, indifferent to the turmoil that had just unfolded. As I walked to my car, I breathed deeply, tasting something that felt like freedom, mingled with the bitter sting of betrayal. I realized that the price of hope had always been high when that hope was borrowed from people who saw you as a means to an end, rather than as a person deserving of respect. Tonight, they had tried to bankrupt me emotionally and legally in one calculated move. But I hadn't budged, and I hadn't given them what they wanted. As I closed my hand around the door handle of my car, I made a vow to myself that felt as solid as steel. If they wanted me back in their lives, they would have to come to me on my terms. This was far from over, but at least now I knew exactly where I stood and exactly where I would draw the line. When the last of the lawyers swept out of the restaurant, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with military precision, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and cold dread wash over me. I watched their retreating figures disappear into the night, then turned back to look at the table where the power of attorney folder still lay completely untouched. Its crisp edges gleamed in the dim candlelight like a weapon that had been abandoned on a battlefield. It was a physical manifestation of everything they had wanted to steal from me. My autonomy, my legacy, my very identity as an independent human being. The audacity of it still took my breath away. I slid out of the booth and stood up, glancing down at Claire one final time. Her face was pale as moonlight, and her eyes held a mixture of guilt and sorrow that was almost heartbreaking to witness. For a moment, I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But something fundamental in me had already snapped under the weight of this betrayal. "I didn't know," she whispered, and her words hung between us as fragile as a spider's web. I didn't know it would be like this. I wanted desperately to tell her that I believed her, that she had been blind to what her mother had orchestrated, that she was as much a victim in this as I was. But I needed steel now, not softness. I needed to be strong enough to fight back against what they had tried to do to me. "Let's go," I said quietly, my voice low but firm. I folded my hands deliberately and gathered the power of attorney document in one swift motion. Those lawyers had believed I would never fight back. They had calculated that my age, my isolation, and my ex-wife's influence would ensure that I would sign immediately without question. They had been completely wrong about me, and their mistake was going to become their undoing. Outside the restaurant, the night air felt sharper than usual, as if the city itself had sensed my newfound resolve and had sharpened its edges in response. I tucked my jacket tighter against the chill and led Claire to my car, leaving the expensive restaurant behind us like a wound I refused to revisit. She climbed into the passenger seat silently, and I followed, placing the folder on the seat between us like evidence in a criminal case. The engine's steady purr was a welcome distraction from the storm of emotions that was raging inside me. Why would they think this was okay? I asked, more to myself than to her, but I let the question hang in the air anyway. After a moment of consideration, I decided to answer my own question. They wanted control, I said finally. Control over my estate, my decisions, my future. They think that if they can take away my legal rights, they can take away my power to resist them. Claire swallowed hard, and I could see her struggling with the implications of what had just happened. But why don't you trust us? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. I love you, Dad. Why would Mom think she needed to... My jaw tightened as I considered how to explain something that should have been obvious. Love isn't measured in lawsuits and signatures, Claire, I said firmly. Love isn't a folder full of legal documents to be signed under pressure and threats. If it were, none of this would have happened in the first place. I pressed the ignition and steered the car onto the deserted street, my headlights slicing through the darkness ahead of us. Family, I continued, is supposed to protect you, not trap you into giving up your fundamental rights. She reached over and touched my arm gently. I'm sorry, she said. I really didn't see it coming. I exhaled slowly, meeting her gaze in the rearview mirror. You were raised by someone who sees all relationships as transactions, I said, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. You grew up thinking that if you paid enough money or negotiated hard enough, you could buy anything you wanted, even affection and loyalty. The confession tasted bitter in my mouth. I wanted to spare you from that reality for as long as possible, but I see now that I may have done you a disservice. She glanced down at her hands, tears glinting in the passing streetlights. I never wanted to hurt you, Dad. I only wanted to feel supported, to know that you cared about my happiness. I pulled into my driveway, and the familiar sight of my house bathed in pale lamplight was comforting. David's truck was parked there, which was proof that I wasn't entirely alone in this fight. I killed the engine and turned to face Claire directly. You can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to normal, I said, not unkindly but with absolute firmness. Not yet. Not after what just happened. Her lips trembled as she asked, What do I need to do to fix this? I opened the glove compartment and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. I had kept Thomas Reed's business card in my wallet for years, knowing that someday I might need someone who actually worked for me rather than against me. First, I said, we call someone who actually represents my interests. I dialed the number, and Thomas's calm, familiar voice answered on the second ring. Robert, good evening, he said. I assume this is good news? Better than good, I replied. I need you at my house right now. There's been a development. He chuckled softly, and I could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background. There's always something with you, isn't there, Robert? All right, I'll be at your place in 20 minutes. I hung up the phone and handed it to Claire. Take this, I instructed. Go sit in the living room and don't answer the door for anyone except Thomas and me. Do you understand? She nodded and exited the car while I grabbed the folder and climbed out, locking the doors behind me. The cold night air pressed in around us, but I felt the warmth of purpose beginning to ignite in my chest. They had thought they could intimidate me into signing away my rights. They had believed that a show of force, a carefully orchestrated dinner ambush, would be enough to break my will. They had completely underestimated me, and the cost of that underestimation was going to be higher than they could imagine. Inside my house, the familiar sense of old books and polished wood greeted me like old friends. I led Claire to the living room sofa, where she curled up with her arms wrapped around herself, clutching her phone as though it were a lifeline. I closed the door behind me and walked down the hallway to my study, feeling the weight of the power of attorney folder in my hand. This wasn't about stubborn pride or petty revenge. This was about survival, about protecting everything I had worked for, and about ensuring that no one could ever again try to strip me of my basic rights as a human being. I went into my study and seated myself at the desk where I had spent countless nights over the years drafting wills, planning investments, and safeguarding my family's financial future. I placed the power of attorney document on the blotter and stared at it, feeling a chill run down my spine at the very idea that this piece of paper could have become legally binding. But I knew exactly how to fight it. I had allies, I had resources, and most importantly, I had the truth on my side. At exactly 7:45, I heard a firm, confident knock on my front door. I opened it to find Thomas standing there with his briefcase in hand and a look of serene confidence on his weathered face. His presence felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. I stepped aside to let him in, closed the door firmly behind him, and led him into my study. This was where the real fight would begin. "Show me what we're dealing with," he said quietly, settling onto the edge of my desk. His eyes shifted immediately to the folder that contained their weapon of choice. "Try this on for size," I said, opening the folder. Unlimited power of attorney. No oversight, no expiration date, no checks and balances. Helen wants me to sign it tonight, and she brought 3 lawyers to make sure I understood that refusal wasn't really an option. Thomas frowned deeply as he thumbed through the pages, his expression growing darker with each paragraph he read. "Robert, this is brazen, even for Helen," he said finally. "This document represents complete overreach. If you had signed this, they would have been able to sweep away any legal protections you have. This is elder abuse by proxy." I watched his face harden with professional anger. Exactly what I thought. He closed the folder, stood up, and laid a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We're going to file motions, injunctions, and formal complaints," he said with quiet determination. "We're going to protect your rights, and we're going to hold each and every one of them accountable for this attempted fraud." A surge of relief washed over me like a warm wave. The fight was far from over, and I knew I still had to navigate complex legal channels, but I wasn't alone anymore. I had someone in my corner who understood the stakes and had the expertise to fight back effectively. As Thomas and I began to strategize our next moves, I thought about Claire waiting in the living room, vulnerable yet brave enough to face me and the truth of what her mother had tried to do. I thought about David, who had been standing by my side throughout this entire ordeal. I realized that the power they had wanted to take from me was nothing compared to the power I still held. I had the power to choose who I trusted, the power to set boundaries, and the power to protect my legacy on my own terms. Tonight, they had learned that boundaries aren't a sign of weakness, and that some lines simply aren't meant to be crossed. They had tried to break me, but instead, they had only made me stronger. The air in my study felt electric when Thomas Reed stepped through the door with his briefcase in hand and that familiar half-smile of his that had always been able to warm even the coldest situations. The power of attorney folder lay on my desk between us like a loaded weapon, its crisp papers serving as a mocking testament to the betrayal that had unfolded at the Heritage Club just hours earlier. I closed the door behind Thomas and guided him toward my desk, my heart hammering with a mixture of relief and unspoken hope that justice might actually arrive tonight. Thomas set his briefcase down with the practiced ease of someone who had done this countless times before and opened it with a satisfying click. To my surprise, he began extracting a stack of folders that was considerably thicker than the one my ex-wife's lawyers had brought to ambush me with. "I thought it might help to have everything organized in one place," he said quietly, his thumb grazing the top document with professional familiarity. His calm confidence was absolutely contagious, like a lighthouse cutting through the thickest fog. I nodded, swallowing back the tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with my age and everything to do with wounded pride and righteous anger. Thomas began laying out photographs first, shots that had been taken from what appeared to be a discreet surveillance operation that he had somehow arranged in the days leading up to tonight. One photograph showed Helen and Michael, Claire's fiancé, whispering outside my garage with papers clutched tightly in their hands, as though they were guarding contraband or plotting some kind of criminal activity. Another image captured Michael's phone tucked beneath his jacket, the screen glowing with what appeared to be emails discussing my supposed incompetence and their strategies to secure control of my estate. I leaned forward, running my fingers over the edges of the glossy prints, each one representing a damning revelation about people I had trusted. Next came audio recordings, snippets of conversation that Thomas had apparently recorded during a chance meeting between Helen and one of the younger lawyers who had been at the restaurant tonight. Their voices were hushed, but remarkably clear, and the content made my blood run cold. "He still doesn't suspect anything," Helen's voice came through the small speaker on Thomas's phone. Once he signs the document, it's ours. Full control, no more surprises, no more resistance. The betrayal stung like salt being poured into an open wound. Claire's tearful apology from earlier in the evening now felt hollow and manipulative, the product of careful coaching rather than genuine remorse. Thomas sorted the evidence into neat, organized piles, his eyes flicking up to meet mine periodically to gauge my reaction. "I have also included witness statements," he said, sliding a sheaf of notarized declarations across the desk toward me. "Your neighbors noticed unfamiliar individuals coming around your house over the past few weeks, asking questions about whether your bills were being paid on time." He paused, glancing at me with an intensity that solidified my growing resolve. "They saw Helen's associate arriving with a courier bag on more than one occasion. People were asking questions designed to create doubt about your competency. And here," he added, extracting what appeared to be a medical report, "is perhaps the most damning piece of evidence we have. It's a forged psychological assessment that claims you suffer from mild cognitive impairment and are no longer capable of managing your own affairs." My breath caught in my throat. The audacity of fabricating medical documents to steal someone's fundamental rights was an outrage I had never imagined could happen in my own life. It forced a furious weight into my chest that made it difficult to breathe normally. "I've traced the digital watermark on this document," Thomas continued, his voice growing harder. "It leads directly to an account that's linked to Helen's law firm. This is forgery, fraud, and conspiracy all rolled into one neat package." I closed my eyes for a moment, willing my rage to steady my voice rather than overwhelm my ability to think clearly. "She crossed every possible line," I said, my tone measured but ice cold. "She used our daughter as bait to lure me into a trap." Thomas nodded grimly. "Robert, we're looking at elder fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and serious professional misconduct by the lawyers who were involved in this scheme. Each of these individuals could lose their licenses to practice law, and they could face significant criminal charges." He leaned forward, his expression becoming even more serious. "More importantly, Claire needs to see this evidence. She needs to understand exactly what her mother was willing to do, and how she was manipulated into participating in this fraud." I gathered the photographs, audio recordings, and witness statements in a manila folder and headed down the hallway toward the living room, with Thomas following close behind me. The light from the large windows was pouring in, illuminating the sofa where Claire sat fidgeting with the corner of a throw blanket. Her phone lay beside her, silent and ignored. She looked up as we entered, her eyes red-rimmed but curious, as though she could sense that something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the house. I set the folder on the coffee table between us and took a seat opposite her, with Thomas settling into the chair to my left. The weight of what I was about to reveal felt enormous, but I knew she deserved to know the truth. "Claire," I began, keeping my voice firm but gentle, "you owe yourself the complete truth about what's been happening." I opened the folder and pulled out the first photograph, the one showing her, Helen, and Michael in what appeared to be a clandestine meeting in my garage. "This conversation happened in your garage on the day before you asked me to that dinner," I said, sliding it across the table toward her. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she recognized herself and the others in the grainy image. "Dad, she stammered, her fingers trembling as they touched the photograph's edge. I set that photo aside and offered her another one. A clearer image of Michael scrolling through what appeared to be my private financial accounts on his phone. "They had been planning to strip me of my rights for weeks," I said steadily. "They forged medical records to prove that I was mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. They used you, my own daughter, to lure me into signing away my entire life." Tears began to well up in Claire's eyes as she reached for the next document I offered her. A transcript of Helen's whispered conversation with her legal associates. As she read her mother's words, her face crumpled with shock and horror. "How could she do this?" she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "How could Mom betray both of us like this?" Thomas handed her one of the witness statements from my neighbors. "Claire, you need to understand that your mother and your fiancé didn't just betray your father," he said gently. "They betrayed you just as much. They manipulated you into participating in a scheme that could have destroyed your family permanently." She sank back against the sofa cushions, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from deep within her chest. I rose from my chair and knelt beside her, putting my arm around her trembling frame. "This was never about protecting you or planning your wedding," I said softly. "This was about power, control, and greed. They saw an opportunity to take everything I've worked for, and they were willing to use you to get it." Her tears soaked through my sleeve as she clung to me desperately. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she said between sobs. I believed her. I thought she was trying to help us, trying to bring our family back together. I stroked her hair gently, resisting the overwhelming urge to unleash a torrent of anger at Helen and Michael for what they had put both of us through. Instead, I held my daughter close, feeling the fragile bond between us strengthen in that moment of shared vulnerability and mutual understanding. The evidence spread across the coffee table told a story of calculated deception and betrayal that went far beyond anything I had imagined possible. But beneath the weight of those damning documents lay a silent promise of justice that felt more solid than anything I had experienced in weeks. Thomas stood and offered a reassuring nod. "We'll file formal complaints tomorrow morning with the district attorney's office and the Bar Association. We'll pursue criminal charges, professional sanctions, everything. They won't see this coming, and they won't be prepared for the full weight of the legal system coming down on them." I squeezed Claire's shoulder gently. "No more hiding, no more lies, no more manipulation," I said firmly. "We're going to reclaim what's ours, and we're going to do it together." As the evening light began to fade outside my windows, I felt a sense of calm determination settle over me like a warm blanket. The path ahead would undoubtedly be fraught with legal battles, court hearings, and emotional reckonings that would test all of us. But for the first time in days, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Justice had walked into my study tonight alongside Thomas Reed, uninvited by my enemies, but absolutely necessary for my survival. I was finally ready to do whatever it took to protect my family, my dignity, and my rights as a human being. Claire lifted her head from my shoulder, her tear-streaked face now set with a newfound resolve that reminded me of the strong, determined woman I had raised. "Let's do it," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. "Let's finish this once and for all." In that shared moment of determination, I found something I had thought was lost forever. Not just vindication for myself, but genuine redemption for the trust between a father and his daughter. Together, we would face whatever legal and emotional challenges lay ahead, united by truth and strengthened by our mutual commitment to justice. When Thomas and I reconvened the next morning at my kitchen table, the atmosphere was thick with purpose and determination. The manila folder of evidence filled with photographs, audio transcripts, sworn affidavits, and that damning forged medical report sat between us like a loaded weapon that we were finally ready to use. I poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Thomas, appreciating the familiar ritual of hospitality even in the midst of what felt like preparation for war. His expression was calm and focused, but I could see the gears turning behind his steady gaze as he mentally organized our strategy. "Let's walk through everything again," he said, tapping the folder with his index finger. "I want to make sure we have a complete understanding of what we can prove in court." I took a steadying breath and began to lay out the timeline of events. "First, we have the surveillance photographs from April 19th, I said, flipping through the glossy prints. Helen and Michael met outside my garage, and they were clearly holding papers. What we now know were the preliminary drafts of the power of attorney document they wanted me to sign. I pointed to one particularly damning image. Look at how they're speaking in hushed tones and glancing over their shoulders, as though they were genuinely afraid of being seen or overheard. This isn't the behavior of people who believe they're doing something legitimate and above board. One image caught my attention and made my stomach clench with anger. It showed Michael's phone screen bright against the twilight, displaying an open email with the subject line, "Dad's incapacitation strategy." The casual cruelty of that phrase, reducing my life and autonomy to a mere strategic problem to be solved, was almost unbearable. Thomas peered over my shoulder at the photograph. "That's absolutely damning," he said with professional satisfaction. "It demonstrates clear premeditation and conspiracy. They weren't just taking advantage of a sudden opportunity. They had been planning this attack on your rights for weeks, possibly months." I nodded and slid the photo across the table to him. "Next, we have the audio recordings," I continued. I had instructed the private investigator to plant a recording device in the hallway outside my study door on the night of the restaurant ambush. I pressed play on my phone, and Helen's voice crackled through the speaker with chilling clarity. She sounded calm, calculating, and utterly ruthless as she spoke to one of her legal associates. "Once he signs the document, we have complete control over everything," her recorded voice said. "And if he hesitates or starts to resist, we'll remind him exactly what's at stake here: his relationship with his grandson and his place in this family." Thomas closed his eyes, absorbing every word with the focused attention of someone who understood the legal implications of what we were hearing. When the recording ended, he opened his eyes and looked at me with grim determination. "Robert, you realize this recording represents conspiracy to commit elder fraud," he said. "They're using the threat of cutting you off from your grandson's life as a weapon to extort you into signing away your legal rights. This is textbook elder abuse." I felt a surge of righteous anger coursing through my veins. "And my daughter stood by and let it happen," I said, clenching and unclenching my fists. "She was complicit in this entire scheme, which is precisely why this medical report is so crucial to our case," Thomas continued, pulling out the forged document that had made my blood boil the night before. "Look at this carefully, Robert. It's supposedly from Dr. Ellen Hastings, and it's dated March 31st. It claims you're suffering from cognitive decline and are no longer capable of managing your own affairs." He tapped the corner of the document where a faint watermark was barely visible. "The problem is that Dr. Hastings never had a patient by your name, and this letterhead doesn't match her clinic's official stationery. More importantly, we've traced this document to Helen's law firm printer using digital forensics." I leaned back in my chair, covering my face with my hands as the full scope of their betrayal sank in. They hadn't just attacked my finances or my family relationships, they had attacked my mind, my cognitive abilities, my fundamental capacity to function as an independent human being. And they had done it all for the sake of a power grab that would have left me completely helpless. "Finally," Thomas said, removing a stack of sworn affidavits from the folder, "we have multiple witness statements from your neighbors. These people saw strangers knocking on your door late one evening, asking pointed questions about whether you were keeping up with your taxes and utility bills." He tapped one of the statements with his finger. "Mrs. Bradford's testimony is particularly compelling. She says, and I quote, 'They asked if Mr. Kane remembered to pay his mortgage, and when I replied that of course he did, they left immediately. It struck me as very odd behavior. The evidence formed a comprehensive and damning picture of premeditated fraud. There had been clandestine meetings, threats disguised as family concern, forged medical records, and manipulated witness testimony. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to destroy my reputation and steal my life's work." I shook my head in disbelief. "I never imagined Helen would stoop this low," I said. "Even during our worst fights during the divorce, I never thought she was capable of something this calculating and cruel." Thomas folded his arms and leaned back in his chair. "She saw you as nothing more than a means to an end, Robert. But now we have all the ammunition we need to dismantle their entire strategy and hold them accountable for what they've done." He produced 2 folders that had been prepared with meticulous care. One was marked Complaint, Bar Association, and the other was stamped Criminal Referral. Just seeing those official labels made my heart race with anticipation. "We're filing both of these today," Thomas said with quiet determination. "There's more than enough evidence here to trigger an immediate investigation by both the Bar Association and the District Attorney's Office. Robert Kane will not be treated as the victim of elder abuse without serious consequences for the perpetrators." I felt an overwhelming swell of gratitude toward Thomas. His legal expertise and strategic mind made him much more than just an attorney. He was a warrior for truth and justice, and I was incredibly fortunate to have him on my side. "What about Claire?" I asked, genuine concern lacing my voice. "She's already been through so much emotional trauma, and she's going to need to testify about what she witnessed." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "We'll definitely need her testimony, and yours as well, of course. But our first priority is to disarm Helen and her associates legally. We need to file these complaints and get the legal machinery in motion. Then we can focus on mending the personal relationships that have been damaged by this whole ordeal." I glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was already 12:15 in the afternoon. It was too late to reach Helen by phone without risking that she would have time to prepare another ambush or destroy evidence. Instead, I picked up my cell phone and called David, who had been my most reliable source of support throughout this entire crisis. "David," I said, keeping my voice steady and controlled, "I need you to meet me at Thomas's office in 1 hour. We're about to file formal complaints, and I want you there as a witness." "I'm on my way, Dad," he replied without hesitation. His immediate support meant more to me than he could possibly know. I hung up and turned back to Thomas, who was already gathering the evidence into organized stacks. "Let's get these complaints filed," I said with renewed determination. "Then I'll be ready to face Helen and her lawyers with the full weight of the law behind me." Thomas stood and extended his hand for a firm handshake. "Let's finish this, Robert," he said. "It's time to show them that you're not someone who can be intimidated or manipulated." By 1:30 that afternoon, we were standing in the courthouse, where Thomas guided me through the clerk's office with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. We filed detailed complaints with both the district attorney's office and the Bar Association, presenting them with the substantial volume of evidence we had gathered. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the thickness of our documentation, but she accepted the filings without question or delay. Each document we submitted felt like a promise, a commitment to justice, and a declaration that what had been done to me would not go unpunished. Outside the courthouse, the spring air felt crisp and clean against my face, as though the act of filing those complaints had somehow purified the atmosphere around me. David was waiting by my car with his arms folded and a steely expression that reminded me of my own determination. He nodded approvingly when I approached. "It's done," I said simply. "Good," he replied, clapping a supportive hand on my shoulder. "Dad, you absolutely did the right thing. This needed to happen." I managed a small but genuine smile. "No, David, we did the right thing. All of us. You, me, Thomas, and even Claire once she was ready to face the truth." David nodded with understanding. "Let her take the time she needs to heal from this betrayal. She'll come around when she's ready." I opened the glove compartment and retrieved the folder of evidence, handing it to him with the solemnity of someone passing on a sacred trust. "Keep this safe," I said. "This represents everything we've fought for." He accepted the folder with a solemn nod. "I will, Dad. You can count on me." As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, I realized that the man I had once been, the one who was always acquiescent and eager to please others at the expense of his own dignity, had been fundamentally changed by this experience. I had rediscovered my own strength and learned to stand up for my rights, even when it meant confronting the people I loved most. The court filings were just the beginning of what would undoubtedly be a long and complex legal battle. There would be hearings, depositions, and emotional reckonings that would test all of us. But in that moment, sitting in my car with the courthouse behind me and the future ahead of me, I felt anchored by the truth and empowered by the knowledge that justice was finally within reach. Driving home, I thought about Claire, who was probably waiting for news about how the world would right itself after the chaos her mother had created. Soon, she would see that betrayal and fraud have real consequences. And when she did, we would be able to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty, respect, and mutual trust. Our new beginning would be stronger than any power of attorney document that Helen had ever tried to force upon me. I woke before dawn the next morning, the house silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant coo of a mourning dove outside my bedroom window. The previous night's revelations had left me emotionally and physically exhausted, but sleep refused to return no matter how much I needed it. Instead, I lay in bed thinking about the false goodwill that had drawn me back to that table at the Heritage Club, remembering how naive I had been to believe that Claire's invitation was genuine. The memory of that power of attorney folder, so innocently labeled yet so devastatingly comprehensive, sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the morning chill. Helen and her lawyers had gambled everything on the assumption that fear and family obligation would make me fold under pressure. They had calculated that my love for Claire and my desire to see my grandson would override my instinct for self-preservation. They had been completely and utterly wrong about who I was and what I was capable of. I made my way downstairs to the kitchen, which was bathed in pale blue light from the street lamp out front. I poured myself a cup of coffee and carried it out onto the back porch, leaning against the familiar railing as I watched fog drift slowly across the lawn like ghostly fingers. This back porch had always been my sanctuary, the place where I could think most clearly and find perspective on whatever challenges life had thrown my way. I inhaled the cool morning air and let the steam rise from my mug, grounding myself in the simplicity of the moment and the knowledge that I had survived something that could have destroyed me. I had drawn my line in the sand, and now I had to enforce it with everything I had. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out an envelope that I had prepared the previous evening, working late into the night with Thomas's guidance. Inside was a revised trust agreement that had been drawn up with meticulous attention to detail. It named David as the sole trustee for my estate, with strict legal instructions that no power of attorney or similar authority would ever be granted again without my express written consent, witnessed by an independent third party. The document was absolutely ironclad, written in language that left no room for interpretation or manipulation. These were my terms, not theirs, and I would not be moved from this position. As I sipped the last of my coffee, I felt the weight of that envelope settle into my hand like a weapon I was finally ready to use. I had one final act to perform in order to completely reclaim control of my life, and that was delivering these terms directly to Helen herself. I dressed quickly and deliberately, choosing my clothes like armor for the battle ahead. Navy slacks, a crisp white shirt, and the silver cufflinks that I always wore when I meant business and wanted to project authority and confidence. These weren't just clothes, they were a statement of intent. I left the trust envelope and a carefully worded cover letter on my desk, both addressed to Helen Kane in my most formal handwriting. In the cover letter, I had spelled out my conditions with absolute clarity and no room for negotiation. I demanded a written apology and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I required the immediate transfer of all related legal files to Thomas's firm for independent review and verification. And I insisted on a public statement acknowledging my mental competency and my rights as her former husband and as the grandfather of our grandson. Anything less than complete compliance with these demands, I had warned in the letter, would result in my pursuing every legal remedy at my disposal, including expanded criminal charges and a civil lawsuit for damages. By mid-morning, I was in my car heading toward Helen's law firm downtown. The drive gave me precious time to steel my nerves and prepare myself mentally for what was likely to be a difficult confrontation. I thought about all the meetings I had endured in that office during our marriage and divorce, all the times I had believed she was acting in good faith and had my best interests at heart. I felt a surge of regret for those wasted years, for all the moments when I had trusted someone who was systematically planning to betray me. But regret was a luxury I could no longer afford to indulge. I needed to focus on the present and the future, not on past mistakes. Helen's law firm was housed in a gleaming glass tower that reflected the city around it like a mirror. I parked on the street and entered the lobby, nodding politely to the receptionist who barely glanced up from her phone. "Mr. Kane is here to see Miss Helen Kane," I announced with quiet authority. The receptionist frowned and flipped through what appeared to be a schedule book, then picked up her phone for a brief, whispered conversation. After a moment, she gestured down the hallway with a practiced smile. "Conference room 14B, she said. "She's expecting you." I squared my shoulders and walked through the corridor, which was lined with framed degrees and professional awards bearing Helen's name. Each certificate and accolade felt like a mockery now, knowing what she had been willing to do to someone who had once loved and trusted her. Inside the conference room, Helen's mahogany desk was spotless and imposing. She stood behind it with her arms crossed, looking weary and defensive. There were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept much better than I had. I placed the envelope on her desk without ceremony and met her gaze directly. "Read it," I said simply. She opened the envelope slowly, her fingers handling the papers as though they might be contaminated. Her eyes moved across the typed paragraphs with increasing tension, and I watched her face grow paler with each demand I had made. When she finished reading, she looked up at me with an expression that mixed disbelief with barely contained anger. "You can't be serious about this, Robert." I sat down in the guest chair and folded my hands calmly in my lap. "I'm more serious than I've ever been in my entire life," I replied. "These are my terms, Helen. They're non-negotiable." She ran a hand through her hair in a gesture of frustration that I remembered from our marriage. "This is ridiculous, Robert. You're making threats based on hurt feelings rather than facts." I leaned forward, allowing some of my anger to show in my voice. No, Helen. These demands are based on facts. Cold, hard, documented facts. You tried to deprive me of my fundamental rights as a human being. You forged medical documents to make me appear incompetent. You weaponized our daughter against me. And you nearly succeeded in stealing everything I've worked for my entire life. Her eyes flickered with something that might have been remorse, or perhaps just regret that her elaborate scheme had been discovered and dismantled. I didn't think you'd fight back this hard, she said quietly. Then you didn't know me as well as you thought you did, I replied. And that was your fatal mistake. I paused, letting the silence deepen between us and forcing her to confront the gravity of what she had done. You have until the end of business tomorrow to comply with every single one of these demands, I said firmly. Otherwise, I will expand the criminal complaints to include contempt of court, and I will file for punitive damages that will make your head spin. Helen's chin lifted in a gesture of defiance that I recognized from countless arguments during our marriage. You wouldn't dare take this that far. I stood up slowly, sliding the letter toward her across the polished surface of her desk. Try me, I said, with quiet menace. I turned and walked out of her office without looking back, the sound of my footsteps echoing down the hallway like a drumbeat of justice. Outside, the spring sun felt warmer on my face than it had in weeks, and I slid into my car with my heart pounding with triumph that was more invigorating than any cup of coffee could ever be. Back home, I found David in the backyard firing up the grill, the familiar domestic scene a welcome contrast to the corporate battlefield I had just left. He looked up with raised eyebrows when he saw my expression. You look victorious, Dad, he observed with a knowing smile. I grinned and handed him my empty coffee cup. Because it worked, I said with satisfaction. He looked at me with curiosity. She agreed to sign the terms? I'll know by tomorrow evening, I replied. But I think she understands now that the line I wouldn't cross has become a boundary that she can't breach. David nodded and returned to his grilling, and I leaned against the fence, watching smoke curl from the coals and feeling a sense of peace that had been missing from my life for weeks. I realized that by standing firm and refusing to compromise my principles, I had reclaimed not only my estate and my legal rights, but something even more precious, my self-respect and my dignity as a human being. In that moment of quiet triumph, I rediscovered a fundamental truth that I had somehow lost along the way. The man I was had never needed anyone's permission to exist, and he certainly didn't need to sign away his autonomy to prove his love for his family. The next morning dawned with deceptive calm, the sky painted in soft gray tones that promised gentle rain yet to come. I sat at my desk in the study, staring at the envelope I had delivered to Helen just yesterday, its terms still echoing in my mind like the tolling of a church bell. I had given her until the previous evening to comply with my demands, and now the clock had officially run out. There had been no phone calls, no emails, no desperate attempts at negotiation. Just silence, the kind of defiant silence that told me everything I needed to know about Helen's intentions. My hands remained steady with purpose as I picked up the phone. There was no trembling, no hesitation, no second guessing of what needed to be done. I dialed Thomas's number first, and his familiar greeting was like a balm to my nerves. I informed him that it was time to escalate our legal response, and he agreed immediately, his tone shifting to pure business mode. He promised to initiate contempt proceedings against Helen and her associates and to prepare comprehensive motions for punitive damages that would send a clear message about the consequences of elder fraud. As I replaced the receiver, I felt my spine straighten with renewed determination. This was much more than legal maneuvering or courtroom strategy. This was a statement about self-respect, dignity, and the fundamental right of every human being to maintain control over their own life. By mid-morning, the promised clouds had thickened overhead, and raindrops began to spatter against my office window pane like nature's percussion section. I slipped into my navy raincoat, practical, hooded, and designed for serious weather, and headed out into the dampening air with my umbrella in hand. The rain carried the scent of wet pavement and the promise of fresh beginnings, and I couldn't help but think of it as nature's way of washing away the debris of betrayal and deception. Inside the courthouse, the halls buzzed with their usual energy. Clerks and attorneys passed by in crisp suits, their footsteps creating a synchronized march toward deadlines, hearings, and the endless pursuit of justice. I navigated back to the familiar clerk's office, now armed with a new set of legal filings that represented the next phase of my fight. I carried a motion for contempt of court, a formal request for an expedited hearing, and a detailed demand for punitive damages that would make Helen and her accomplices think twice before attempting something like this again. Each document laid bare the violations of my rights and the escalating stakes of Helen's continued defiance. The clerk who had helped me before looked up with recognition and what appeared to be sympathy as she stamped each page with official authority. "Quite the storm you're brewing, Mr. Kane," she muttered under her breath as her eyes flicked to the manila envelope tucked under my arm. I managed a small but determined smile. "I prefer clear skies myself," I replied. "But sometimes a storm is necessary to wash away all the accumulated dirt and corruption." Back at home, I found Claire sitting at my kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea cradled between her palms, staring out at the rain-soaked landscape. David was nearby, nursing his own mug of coffee and radiating the kind of protective concern that only family can provide. Their worry was palpable in the air, but I refused to let them see the bone-deep weariness that was hiding beneath my resolve. I hung my raincoat on a chair and washed my hands at the kitchen sink, letting the warm water run over my fingers as I tried to clarify my thoughts and prepare for whatever questions they might have. "Dad," Claire said tentatively, her voice carrying the weight of everything that had happened between us. "What happens now?" Her eyes were still red from the tears she had shed over her mother's betrayal, but I could see something new in their depths. A kind of pride and determination that reminded me of the strong, independent woman I had raised her to become. I dried my hands methodically and turned to face both of my children. "Now we wait for the court to hear our motion," I explained. "They have the power to hold Helen in contempt of court, to levy substantial fines against her and her law firm, and even to impose professional sanctions that could end her legal career." I paused, searching Claire's face for understanding. "And if she continues to refuse to comply with the terms I set forth, we'll move forward with punitive damages that will make this entire ordeal very expensive for everyone involved. But the most important thing," I continued, "is that Helen understands once and for all that you, David, and I are not pawns to be sacrificed for her personal ambition or financial gain." Claire nodded slowly, swallowing hard as she processed the implications. "I'll be here for as long as it takes, Dad," she said with quiet determination. "I want to see this through to the end." David clapped me firmly on the shoulder, his support as unwavering as it had been throughout this entire ordeal. "And I'll handle all the logistics," he said. "Filings, notifications, courier services, whatever you need to make this work." His loyalty meant more to me than he could possibly know. It was the kind of support that only comes from family bonds that have been tested by fire and found to be unbreakable. The waiting felt heavier than anything I'd experienced so far. Every tick of the clock on my kitchen wall was a reminder of the demands I had placed on Helen, and the very real possibility that she might choose to dig in her heels rather than acknowledge what she had done wrong. But something fundamental had shifted inside me during this entire ordeal. The fear that had initially driven my responses had been completely replaced by conviction. The adrenalized anger that had fueled my initial fight was slowly morphing into a calm, steady assurance that justice would ultimately prevail, regardless of how long it took. On the third day after I had delivered my ultimatum, when the rain had finally ceased and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, I left the house for a late afternoon walk through my neighborhood. The sidewalks glistened with moisture, reflecting the streetlights and patches of silver sky like a mirror whirled beneath my feet. I passed couples huddled together in light jackets, children splashing joyfully in puddles that had formed during the storm, and neighbors greeting each other with the kind of cautious optimism that comes after difficult weather has finally passed. It struck me that life was continuing to move forward, regardless of the personal battles that individual people were fighting. The world didn't stop spinning because one man was defending his dignity against family members who had betrayed his trust. When I returned home, there was a message waiting on my answering machine, an email notification that made my heart race with anticipation. The subject line read, "Compliance Documents," and the sender was listed as Helen's legal assistant. My pulse quickened as I opened the email on my computer. Attached to the message were signed acknowledgments of wrongdoing, documentation showing the transfer of all pertinent legal files to Thomas's firm, and a carefully drafted public statement affirming my mental competency and my rights as both Helen's former husband and our grandson's grandfather. There were no excuses, no attempts at justification, no further delays or negotiations. Just complete compliance with every single demand I had made. I exhaled slowly, feeling relief and vindication wash over me in equal measure. The final power play that Helen had attempted, an act of desperation designed to reclaim control through legal intimidation, had failed completely and utterly. She had been forced to acknowledge publicly that her schemes couldn't break me, and that they couldn't permanently damage my relationships with Claire and David. Most importantly, she had been compelled to recognize that her elaborate conspiracy had been nothing more than an expensive failure. That evening, we gathered in my living room with the trust agreement and all the court filings stacked neatly on the coffee table, like tangible evidence of our victory. I looked at Claire and David, their faces showing a mixture of exhaustion and triumph, and I realized that our family had endured something far more challenging and dangerous than any simple financial dispute. We had weathered a coordinated attack on our relationships, our trust, and our fundamental bonds as a family. We had survived betrayal from someone who should have been protecting us, and we had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. Claire lifted her teacup in a quiet toast, her voice soft but filled with strength. "To Dad," she said, "for showing me what it really means to stand your ground when everything is at stake." I raised my own glass of water, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the beverage. "And to both of you," I replied, "for standing with me when it would have been easier to walk away." David grinned and joined our impromptu celebration. "Next time, maybe we can settle our family disputes with something less dramatic, like a fishing trip instead of a court hearing." Laughter rippled through the room, providing a healing balm that soothed the collective wounds we had all endured. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and the horizon was beginning to glow with the promise of clear skies and new beginnings. I realized that while Helen's final attempt at manipulation had been ruthless and calculating, it had also forced all of us to confront truths that we might otherwise have continued to ignore. In doing so, it had reminded me that boundaries aren't just arbitrary lines drawn in the sand. They're fundamental declarations of self-worth and human dignity. I settled back into my sofa, feeling the weight of the past few weeks finally beginning to lift from my shoulders. Tomorrow, I would be speaking at the Elder Rights Seminar, sharing my story so that others could learn from my experience and perhaps avoid similar traps. But tonight, I simply savored the rare peace that comes after a hard-fought victory, knowing that this chapter of my life had been reclaimed entirely on my own terms, and that the man I had always been would never again be diminished by anyone's scheme or manipulation. The late afternoon sun filtered through the slats of my backyard blinds, casting long golden stripes across the wooden deck where we had gathered as a family. David stood at the grill with practiced expertise, tending to the glowing ember-red coals beneath his careful supervision. Smoke curled upward into the warm air, carrying the mouth-watering scent of sizzling chicken and perfectly charred vegetables. Behind us, the freshly mowed lawn stretched toward the fence that separated my property from my neighbors, creating a sense of peaceful boundaries and domestic tranquility. In this moment of simple, ordinary life, I found myself marveling at how miraculous the mundane could feel after weeks of legal turmoil and family betrayal. I had just stepped outside, still carrying the emotional echo of the closing argument I had delivered at the Elder Rights Seminar earlier that day. The memory of standing before that crowd of retirees, faces lined with years of wisdom and experience, was still fresh in my mind. I had shared my story not as a tale of victimhood or self-pity, but as a powerful testament to the importance of setting firm boundaries and defending them against all attacks. I had described in detail how Helen had orchestrated her elaborate ambush, how the lawyers had descended upon me like vultures, and how Thomas's timely intervention had literally saved me from losing everything I had worked for. Rather than receiving pity or sympathy from the audience, I had been met with nods of understanding, recognition, and genuine admiration. I had concluded my presentation by urging everyone in attendance to remain vigilant against similar schemes, to insist on clear and transparent terms in all their family relationships, and most importantly, to trust their own judgment even when people they loved were pressuring them to surrender their rights. The enthusiastic applause that had followed my speech had warmed me more deeply than any fireplace ever could. Now, as I took a seat at the familiar picnic table that was still warm from the afternoon sun, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and peace. David approached with a plate piled high with fragrant rice pilaf and perfectly grilled asparagus, the vegetables still steaming from their time over the coals. Claire joined us moments later, carrying 2 tall glasses of iced tea that sparkled with condensation in the golden light. Her eyes shone with a gratitude that seemed to emanate from deep within her bones, the kind of profound appreciation that only comes when you've witnessed the very worst of human behavior and then seen it overcome by courage and determination. "Thanks," I said to both of them as I accepted the food and drink, feeling genuinely grateful for these simple acts of care and consideration. The evening breeze carried the distant sounds of children riding bicycles down the block, their laughter mixing with the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. I took a sip of the iced tea, and the cool sweetness was like a healing balm on wounds that were finally beginning to close. It was restorative in a way that went far beyond mere physical refreshment. David settled onto the bench across from me, his expression thoughtful and slightly amazed. "It's surreal, isn't it, Dad?" he said, glancing around at our peaceful backyard gathering. 1 month ago, this whole area felt empty and lifeless, like something important was missing. Now look at this. It's become a reminder of what really matters in life. I nodded, running my thumb along the edge of my glass as I considered his words. "I know exactly what you mean," I replied. "I kept forgetting that life has a way of carrying on, even when you're fighting battles you never saw coming. But sitting here cooking outdoors with both of you, sharing a meal and telling stories, it feels like I'm finally reclaiming my own narrative." Claire smiled warmly, reaching up to brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear in a gesture that reminded me of her as a little girl. "Dad, you've been through absolute hell over the past few weeks," she said with obvious admiration. "Yet here you are, grilling chicken and sharing stories like nothing can break your spirit. Honestly, I'm incredibly proud of you." A surge of deep tenderness washed over me as I listened to her words. I realized that the pride she was expressing, more than any inheritance, more than any signed trust document, more than any legal victory, was what I most wanted to pass down to my children. "Thank you," I said, my voice growing thick with emotion. "And I'm proud of you for seeing through the lies and manipulation, for standing by me when it would have been easier to take your mother's side, and for not letting fear determine the course of your actions." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. I felt the slight calluses on her fingertips, evidence of the hard work she put into her own career, and her determination to build an independent life. Those small imperfections were proof of her strength and self-reliance. "I screwed up badly, Dad," she whispered, her voice heavy with regret. "I trusted Mom when I should have trusted my own instincts about what was right and wrong." "You were raised to be obedient and compliant," I said gently, trying to remove any trace of blame from my voice. "Your mother taught you to believe that hard work and compliance would earn you security and love. You learned that questioning authority figures, even when they were wrong, was somehow disloyal or ungrateful." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "But sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to question the people you love, especially when they're asking you to participate in something that violates your fundamental values." Claire's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she absorbed what I was saying. "I'm learning that lesson now," she said. "I'm learning what family really means when it's based on honesty and mutual respect rather than fear and obligation." She took a deep breath, as though she were releasing months of accumulated tension and guilt. "I don't want to lose what we have here again, Dad. I don't want to go back to the way things were." "Then don't," I said with quiet firmness. "We move forward together from this point on. No more secrets, no more hidden agendas, no more manipulation disguised as family loyalty." I raised my glass of iced tea in a gesture of celebration. "To family, genuinely reclaimed and rebuilt on a foundation of truth." Claire and David echoed the toast, and our glasses chimed together with a sound that felt like a benediction, a blessing on our renewed commitment to each other. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and lavender, I signaled to David, who lifted the grill lid and began transferring the perfectly cooked chicken to a serving platter. The evening air was beginning to cool, so I added a few logs to the fire pit at the edge of our table, watching as sparks flew upward and disappeared into the darkening sky. I leaned back in my chair and let myself drift into memory, thinking about all the precious moments I had shared with Claire and David over the years. I remembered the first time I had taught Claire to ride a bicycle on this very lawn, how she had wobbled and fallen but gotten back up with determination. I thought about the picnic blankets we used to spread here, covered with sandwiches and homemade lemonade during lazy summer afternoons. I remembered Claire's first day of school, when she had been so nervous about leaving home, and the proud tears I had wiped away when she delivered her high school graduation speech. Those moments, which I had once taken for granted, now gleamed with new significance and meaning. "Dad," David said softly, breaking me out of my reverie, "I've arranged for Thomas to handle the final paperwork tomorrow. Once the court issues its final orders, everything will be completely ironclad. No one will ever be able to challenge your trust or question your mental capacity again." I nodded, feeling the last remnants of worry and anxiety finally ebb away like a tide retreating from the shore. "That's good," I said simply. "That's very good." The relief that washed over me felt like a wave pulling back to reveal solid, stable ground beneath my feet. I was finally free from the threat that had loomed over me for so many weeks. Claire stood up and stretched, brushing a few crumbs from her blouse with casual grace. "I'm going inside to make dessert," she announced with a smile. "Pecan pie and Dad, I remember that you like yours with extra whipped cream on top." I smiled back at her, touched by this small but meaningful gesture of care and attention. "You remember very well indeed." She turned and disappeared through the patio door, leaving David and me alone to enjoy the peaceful evening air. We exchanged a meaningful glance, and he cracked a knowing grin. "Your daughter knows you better than you know yourself sometimes," he said with obvious affection. "She certainly knows you better than any lawyer or legal document ever could." I chuckled softly, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the food or the fire. We continued eating in comfortable, companionable silence for several more minutes, both of us content to watch the sky deepen from gold to deep lavender as evening settled around us. Finally, I pointed toward the fire pit where the flames were beginning to die down. "Shall we put this out and head inside?" David nodded in agreement. We carefully extinguished the fire, making sure the coals were completely dead beneath the ash. Then he closed the grill, and we began stacking the dishes in preparation for taking them inside. These simple domestic chores felt almost sacred to me, like a spiritual ritual of tidying up after a hard-fought victory. Every plate we stacked, every utensil we gathered, felt like a small celebration of our survival and our renewed bonds as a family. Inside the house, the air was filled with the rich, comforting sense of vanilla and cinnamon. I found Claire in the kitchen, expertly whipping cream into perfect white clouds of fluff. She heard me approaching and turned around with a spoon in her hand and a mischievous smile on her face. "Want a taste?" she offered, holding out the spoon toward me. I took a small dollop of the whipped cream and let it melt on my tongue, savoring the sweetness and the simple pleasure of the moment. "Perfect," I declared, with genuine appreciation. "Exactly the way I like it." We carried the finished pecan pie to the dining room, where the three of us sat around the table, passing plates and sharing easy laughter. The world outside felt distant and unimportant now. All that truly mattered was the warmth and love that filled this room, the shared meal we were enjoying, and the knowledge that we had survived something that could have permanently destroyed our family. As I savored each bite of the sweet, rich pecan pie, I realized that in reclaiming my estate and my legal rights, I had also reclaimed something infinitely more precious, my life itself. The simple pleasures that make existence meaningful, the unbreakable bonds of genuine family love, and the dignity that comes from standing firm in your principles, even when the cost seems unbearably high. As Claire leaned over and whispered, "Thank you for everything, Dad," I knew without any doubt that this chapter of our story, the real reunion, the authentic reconciliation, was only the very beginning of what we could build together going forward. 6 months have passed since I first drew my line in the sand and refused to be intimidated into submission, and I find myself standing at the edge of a courtroom once more. Only this time, I'm not here as a defendant under siege or a victim pleading for mercy. Instead, I'm here as a champion for those who've been silenced, marginalized, and exploited by people they trusted most. The spring air drifts in through the high, arched windows of the community center, carrying with it the faint, sweet scent of blooming dogwoods and the promise of renewal that comes with changing seasons. I straighten my tie one final time, feeling the weight of my journey settle into something that feels remarkably like purpose and calling. Before me sit rows upon rows of elders, retirees with weathered hands and wise eyes, caregivers whose faces show the strain of constant vigilance, and concerned family members whose expressions reflect a mixture of weariness and cautious hope. These are people who understand vulnerability, who have experienced the fear that comes with aging in a society that often sees them as burdens rather than treasures. I take a deep, steadying breath, feeling the accumulated experiences of the past 6 months transform into something I can share with others who might be facing similar challenges. The murmurs and whispered conversations gradually hush as I step up to the podium. "Good morning, everyone," I begin, my voice steady and clear. "My name is Robert Kane, and 6 months ago I faced a crisis that threatened to strip away everything I held dear in this world." I pause, letting my words settle over the audience like a blanket. My autonomy, my dignity, my financial security, and my relationship with my own family were all under attack from people I had trusted with my life. I was ambushed by those closest to me, who wielded legal documents like weapons and used emotional manipulation as their primary strategy. I can see heads nodding in recognition throughout the audience. These people understand exactly what I'm talking about, because many of them have lived through similar experiences or are currently facing comparable threats. But through a single phone call to someone I could trust, an unwavering commitment to maintaining my boundaries, and the unexpected support of my children and friends, I was able to reclaim my life completely, I continue. And I'm here today to tell you that you can do the same thing. The room feels electric with attention and possibility. It's strange and humbling to be standing here, transformed from the man who once doubted his own strength and questioned whether he deserved to be treated with basic respect. As I begin to outline the specific tactics that were used against me, the forged medical reports designed to make me appear incompetent, the clandestine lawyer meetings held without my knowledge, the threats to bar me from my grandson's life if I didn't comply with their demands, I watch the audience shift in their seats. Shoulders straighten, eyes focus with laser intensity, and I can feel their collective recognition of the dangers I'm describing. Perhaps some of them have faced similar skirmishes over wills and estate planning, over care decisions that were made without their input, over the persistent fear of being declared mentally incompetent by family members who see them as obstacles rather than people deserving of respect. Every word I speak seems to resonate, not just as a warning about what could happen, but as an invitation to reclaim their own power and agency. You too can stand your ground when everything seems to be working against you. You too can demand to be treated with dignity and respect. I describe in detail the moment when Thomas Reed, my longtime friend and attorney, walked through those steakhouse doors with evidence in hand and unwavering resolve in his eyes. I recount how, in that tense dinner booth surrounded by people who were supposed to love me, I refused to sign away my fundamental rights even when my own daughter seemed to be supporting my attackers. I confess openly about the pain I felt watching Claire torn between loyalty to me and allegiance to her mother's manipulative schemes. But I also share the miracle that followed, our genuine reunion, forged in truth and mutual respect, when she finally apologized not just with words, but with concrete actions, testifying in court and helping me rebuild the trust I thought was permanently lost. By the time I reached the part of my story where I described the trust document I redrew, naming David as trustee under strict terms that could never again be violated, the room has fallen completely silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning system. I lean forward slightly, pressing home the most important lesson of my entire ordeal. Setting boundaries isn't an act of cruelty or selfishness, I say with conviction. It's an act of self-respect and genuine love. When we allow others to make decisions on our behalf, decisions that systematically erode our independence and dignity, we teach them that our lives are theirs to control and manipulate. I pause, making eye contact with as many people in the audience as I can. But when we say no, when we demand transparency and accountability, when we insist on being treated as competent adults rather than children who need constant supervision, we reclaim our authority over our own existence. After I finish speaking, the applause is immediate, heartfelt, and sustained. Hands clap enthusiastically, heads nod in vigorous agreement, and I notice more than a few eyes glistening with tears of recognition and hope. I step down from the podium amid this ripple of gratitude and empowerment, feeling like I've genuinely contributed something meaningful to the world. I approached the nonprofit organizer whose dedicated volunteer team had helped me share my story as widely as possible, reaching people who needed to hear that resistance was possible and victory was achievable. She embraces me warmly, thanking me for empowering not just the audience but her own aging parents, who had been facing pressure from other family members to surrender control of their finances. Volunteers approach me with questions that show they've been listening carefully and thinking deeply about their own situations. Where can they find reputable legal counsel who will actually represent their interests? How should they phrase boundary-setting conversations with family members who refuse to respect their autonomy? What warning signs should they watch for that indicate someone is planning to exploit them? I answer each question patiently and thoroughly, channeling the determination and clarity I had discovered in myself during those frightening nights when everything seemed to be falling apart around me. Later, as I gather my notes and presentation materials and slip them carefully into my briefcase, I notice Claire waiting in the back row of the auditorium. She stands up slowly, offering me a proud smile and an enthusiastic thumbs up that crinkles the corners of her eyes in the way that always reminds me of the little girl she used to be. David joins her a moment later, clapping softly in appreciation of what I've accomplished. Their presence here reminds me powerfully of why I fought so hard in the first place. It wasn't ultimately about money or property or legal documents. It was about preserving a legacy of integrity, love, and mutual respect that I could pass down to the people who matter most to me. When I reach them at the back of the room, Claire embraces me with a fierceness that takes my breath away. I inhale the familiar scent of her perfume, which has become a comforting anchor through every storm we've weathered together. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," she says, her voice thick with emotion. "You've turned something terrible into something that's going to help so many people." Driving home later that evening, the city lights flicker past my car windows like tiny beacons of hope and possibility. But I feel illuminated from within, powered by the knowledge that my personal struggle has been transformed into something larger than myself. My grandson's voice echoes in my mind from our phone call yesterday. "Grandpa, when are you coming to visit? I miss you so much." Soon, I had promised him. Very soon, I'll be stepping into his world on my own terms. No lawyers hovering in the background. No legal documents defining the boundaries of our relationship. No threats or manipulation clouding our time together. Just an eager young boy and a grandfather who kept his promise to remain free and independent. I pull into the driveway of my home, where the porch light glows like a beacon of welcome and safety. As I step inside, I'm greeted by the warmth of family, the lingering scent of the dinner we shared earlier, the soft murmur of a late-night television show, and the profound knowledge that the battles I fought and won have led me back to this place, whole, unbroken, and stronger than I ever imagined possible. In the quiet sanctuary of my study, I place my briefcase on the floor beside my desk and switch off the lamp beside my favorite reading chair. I sit down and close my eyes for a moment, reflecting on the man I was 6 months ago and the man I have become through this ordeal. I am no longer defined by other people's expectations or manipulated by their schemes and threats. I am no longer willing to sacrifice my dignity for the illusion of family harmony. I am free in the truest sense of the word. And as I breathe in the stillness of this moment, I know that reclaiming my life wasn't just about protecting what was rightfully mine. It was about modeling courage, self-worth, and principled resistance for those I love, and for everyone who might one day find themselves standing at the edge of their own battlefield, wondering if they have the strength to fight back against injustice and betrayal.